The quiet suburban neighborhood looked like any other. Rows of manicured lawns, tidy houses, and a sense of peace that only the suburbs could offer. The protagonist, a young man in his 20s, had recently moved in, eager to start fresh. The big city had worn him out, and this small community seemed like the perfect escape. He dreamed of a slower pace, no more chaos, and maybe even a little peace. He didn't think much of the Homeowners Association, HOA, when he first arrived. The previous tenant had warned him about it, but he shrugged it off. After all, how bad could it be? He'd been a model neighbor, keeping to himself, keeping his lawn in shape, and respecting the guidelines. What could possibly go wrong? But then came Karen. She wasn't an official member of the HOA at first glance, just another neighbor, or so he thought. The day he met her was the same day he put up his mailbox, a simple task that, in any other neighborhood, wouldn't warrant a second thought. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp, yet falsely sweet, as she approached him on her daily walk. Her eyes flicked over his new mailbox, then to his freshly mowed lawn. He barely had a chance to introduce himself before she spoke again. "That mailbox is slightly off-center," she said, her gaze lingering on the small metallic box with disdain. "The rules state that all mailboxes must be aligned perfectly with the curb. You might want to fix that before you get fined." Taken aback, he tried to reason with her. He'd just moved in. How could she possibly know the rules better than he did? But she wasn't having it. "I've been a member of the HOA for years," she said, her tone a bit too smug for comfort. "I'll make sure you're aware of all the rules soon enough." She walked away without another word, leaving him to stand there, puzzled. It wasn't until later that evening, when he found the HOA's first official letter sitting on his doorstep, that the weight of her words hit him. Violation. Improper mailbox alignment. He stared at the letter, disbelief mingling with irritation. This was absurd, he thought. It was a mailbox, a tiny imperfection that didn't even affect anyone else's life. But he had no choice but to comply. The HOA was notorious for being relentless. He spent the next hour, grumbling under his breath, adjusting the mailbox exactly to the letter's specifications. But that was just the beginning. Days passed, and the complaints continued. The trash cans, he was told, were to be kept hidden from view at all times, even when they weren't in use. The lawn needed to be trimmed by 8 a.m. sharp, and the hedge by the fence had to be cut to a specific height, never too tall, never too short. The rules felt suffocating, overbearing, and as the days wore on, the protagonist began to feel like he was living in a prison, one with very particular bars. Each morning, he'd find a new complaint in his mailbox, accompanied by a threat of a fine. It was always signed by Karen, the unofficial enforcer of the neighborhood. She had somehow infiltrated every corner of the HOA, using her position to ensure that everyone followed her interpretation of the rules. No exceptions, no mercy. Something didn't feel right. She wasn't just doing her job. She was enjoying the power, relishing in the control she had over his life. And as the complaints grew more frequent and more petty, the sense of unease deepened. Then, one morning, the protagonist found a letter from the HOA that seemed different, a threat of a fine for not having his lawn maintained to a proper standard. He was barely able to hide his frustration when he read it, but there was no ignoring it now. The tension in the air was unmistakable. He was caught in her web, and no matter how hard he tried to avoid it, Karen wasn't going to let him slip away. But what he didn't know yet, what neither he nor anyone else could have guessed, was that this battle wasn't just about lawns and mailboxes. This was a war for control, and Karen was only one side of it. There was far more at stake than he'd realized. And the worst part, he hadn't even scratched the surface of what was coming next. The first week in the neighborhood had been a blur of adjusting to new routines, unpacking boxes, and making small talk with the few neighbors who weren't busy hiding behind their own curtains. Everything seemed fine until Karen struck again. It started with an innocuous knock on his door one afternoon. The protagonist, still adjusting to his new surroundings, opened it with a smile, only to be greeted by the stern, almost judgmental gaze of the woman he had met earlier. "Your trash cans," she said, not bothering with a greeting. Her voice was crisp, her eyes sharp with purpose. "They were left out too long yesterday. The HOA has clear rules about trash collection. You need to keep them hidden behind the garage where they can't be seen from the street. I trust you'll get that sorted out immediately." He blinked, a moment of disbelief flashing across his face. Trash cans. Seriously. He had already followed the rules. He had taken them in as soon as they were emptied. But she was insistent, her eyes never wavering, as if she were waiting for him to apologize for a grave infraction. He nodded reluctantly, trying to maintain his patience, and said he'd take care of it. It seemed like a small issue, a trivial inconvenience. Yet by the time he had turned around to close the door, something in the back of his mind stirred. The incident nagged at him, lingering longer than it should have. Why had she come over personally to make this one tiny complaint? And why did she seem so pleased to do it? A few days passed before the next complaint came. The lawn. According to the HOA rules, the grass should be kept between 2 and 3 inches, trimmed perfectly in rows, with no irregular patches. Karen had been back on patrol. He didn't know how she did it, but she was always watching, always lurking, like a hawk ready to swoop down at any perceived imperfection. He measured the lawn, of course, to make sure everything was in line. His grass was precisely 2 inches, a perfect green. There was no way it could be wrong. And yet there it was, another complaint. She had even attached a photo, taken from a distance, showing an almost imperceptible patch of slightly higher grass. "Your lawn has failed the HOA inspection. You must fix this or face a fine," the letter read. It was getting out of hand. He hadn't even received the full list of HOA requirements. And yet, Karen had managed to find a flaw in everything he did. But the worst part wasn't the absurdity of her complaints. It was the way she wielded her authority like a weapon, each complaint feeling more like an attack than a rule enforcement. There was no room for negotiation. It wasn't about the lawn or the trash cans. It was about control. And in her eyes, he was already failing. That night, as he sat down at his desk to review the HOA guidelines, a creeping suspicion began to grow. What was this about? Why was she singling him out? Was it just her personality, or was there something more behind her relentless scrutiny? He dug deeper into the HOA's history, researching its rules, regulations, and the board members. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. The HOA, for all its community spirit, was essentially a dictatorship with Karen at the helm. But it wasn't just her authority that made him uneasy. It was how she had infiltrated every aspect of the neighborhood's life. How people feared her, how they avoided confrontation with her. Everyone seemed to follow her lead without question. She had built an empire of power, one where she was untouchable. The protagonist, however, had no intention of playing by her rules. But what could he do? Every step he took was met with another complaint, another correction. He couldn't just ignore her. It wasn't just about his lawn anymore. There was something deeper, something darker at play here. And he was beginning to realize he was just one of many pawns in her game. As the night grew darker, he sat back in his chair, a sense of dread slowly overtaking him. The unease in his gut was growing. Karen wasn't just an ordinary neighbor. She wasn't just a stickler for rules. She was a force to be reckoned with. And he was beginning to see that fighting her wouldn't be as simple as fixing a few mistakes. What had he gotten himself into? Days blurred together, the monotony of complaints and fines creating a suffocating atmosphere around the protagonist. No matter what he did, Karen was always there, her shadow looming over every small decision he made. What started as simple nuisances, slightly crooked mailboxes, and an untrimmed lawn, was now beginning to feel like an all-out war. And he was starting to realize that he wasn't just being watched. He was being targeted. One night, As he sat at his desk, the soft hum of the city outside his window, there was a sudden knock on the door. His stomach tightened. Another complaint. Another impossible demand. He opened the door cautiously, his mind racing. It was Karen again, standing there with her arms folded, looking more determined than ever. "I've just seen something I'm going to have to report," she said, her voice cold, almost too calm. "Your front porch is cluttered. I've had multiple complaints from neighbors about the mess. You need to clean it up immediately." He blinked. His porch. It was simple. A few potted plants, a couple of chairs. Hardly what one could call clutter. His pulse quickened. Was she really coming to him with this? "Clutter?" he asked, his voice strained with disbelief. "There's nothing here. Just some plants. A few chairs. Nothing out of the ordinary." "Not everyone shares your opinion," she snapped. "And frankly, I don't need to explain myself. I've had multiple complaints from your neighbors about the state of your porch, and frankly, it's affecting the aesthetic of the entire block." Her words felt like a jab, sharp, personal. Something about the way she spoke, the way she watched him with a predator's gaze, made him uncomfortable. It was no longer about the rules. It was about power. Before he could respond, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving him standing there, staring at the space she had just deemed unsightly. A tight knot formed in his chest. It wasn't the porch. It was him. She was picking him apart, piece by piece, searching for any excuse to tear him down. That night, sleep didn't come easily. His thoughts raced, spiraling into a mix of frustration and confusion. Why was she doing this? Why him? He hadn't done anything to provoke her. The more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. She wasn't just trying to enforce rules. She was actively making his life miserable, finding fault in everything he did. But there was one thing he hadn't considered, how deep this really went. He spent the next day walking through the neighborhood, casually observing the other houses, the yards, and the lawns. As he passed one home, he noticed the grass was slightly overgrown. A few doors down, a mailbox sat at a slight angle, definitely not perfectly aligned with the curb. He knew Karen had seen these things. She'd seen it all, and yet she had never complained. Why? The pieces were starting to fall into place. He wasn't the only one who had noticed Karen's strange obsession with his house. Neighbors he'd spoken to had all quietly complained about her, but none of them had dared speak out. Fear. They were afraid of her, afraid of what she might do if they stood up to her. The power she held wasn't just about rules and regulations. It was the fear she had instilled in everyone around her. But the worst part, the more he dug into her behavior, the more he realized it wasn't just petty control. Karen had a network, an entire system of influence and manipulation, not just within the HOA but within the community itself. People didn't just follow her because they had to. They followed her because she made them believe they had no choice. And yet, despite the mounting tension, something deeper still tugged at him. She wasn't just the queen bee of the HOA, dictating what color fences could be or how high the grass should grow. There was something more behind her, something dark and hidden. Why had she singled him out? And why was she so relentless in her pursuit? That night, he resolved to find out. He would uncover what she was hiding, who she really was behind that perfect, polished facade. Because something about Karen didn't add up, and he was going to find out exactly what. But little did he know, the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous the game would become. The sun had barely risen when the next letter arrived. The envelope, unmistakably from the HOA, was waiting for him by the door, taunting him with its official insignia. His stomach twisted as he picked it up, the weight of it heavier than the others. This time, though, it wasn't just another complaint about his mailbox or lawn. This one was different. Final warning. Excessive noise complaint. His heart skipped a beat. Noise. The letter described an alleged violation of HOA noise regulations, accusing him of making excessive noise late at night with his loud machinery and disturbing the peace. He had no idea what this was about. He had never used loud machinery at night, no late-night lawnmower sessions or anything of the sort. He tore the letter open and read it again, his mind spinning. Excessive noise? For what? He had been careful, quiet even. The letter mentioned a previous warning, but he had never received anything like it. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. The message was clear. She was escalating things. The fine was steep, and the tone of the letter was chilling. There was no room for negotiation, no explanation offered. If he didn't comply, a fine would be imposed, and if he didn't pay, further legal action would follow. It was a punishment with no crime, a power move designed to break him. His hands trembled as he set the letter down on the kitchen counter. He couldn't let this go on anymore. How far would she push him before he broke? Each complaint felt more like a personal attack, each violation more petty than the last. He had followed the rules. He had even gone above and beyond, keeping everything neat, tidy, and up to standard. And yet, Karen wasn't satisfied. Something snapped inside him. This had to stop. It wasn't just about the rules anymore. It wasn't about the mailbox or the lawn or even the noise complaint. It was about power, about her need to control every inch of his life. He had to confront her, but the question was, how? His thoughts were racing, his adrenaline pumping. He couldn't go on playing by her rules. He wasn't just fighting a neighbor. He was fighting an empire, Karen's empire, a kingdom built on fear and submission. And as he stood there in his kitchen, something inside him clicked. He wasn't going to let her win. He wasn't going to let her destroy his life over nothing. The next morning, he decided to pay a visit to the one person who might be able to help him. It wasn't the police. He knew they would do nothing. No, he needed someone with more power, someone who would understand the stakes. He called his father, his dad, the sheriff, the one person in the town who had the clout to take on someone like Karen. The sheriff's department was a quiet, calm force in the town, mostly handling routine calls. But his father had connections, and those connections could be the key to exposing the truth. "I need your help," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "There's a problem with the HOA, with Karen. She's gone too far. I need to know what I'm up against." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, he thought his father might brush him off, maybe even tell him to handle it himself. But instead, his dad responded, the calm tone of his voice hiding something darker beneath it. "You know, I've had a few complaints about her over the years," his father said slowly. "But I didn't want to get involved. Thought it was just the usual small-town drama." His stomach twisted. Had his father known? Had he been letting this happen without stepping in? "You've got a bigger problem than you think, son," his father added, his voice lowering. "I'll help you, but be careful. There's more to her than meets the eye." The call with his father had done little to calm his nerves. In fact, it only heightened the feeling that he was stepping into something far more dangerous than he had imagined. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected his father to know about Karen, let alone be so reluctant to get involved. The sheriff's voice had been laced with a tension he couldn't quite understand, as if there was something hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly quiet neighborhood. He couldn't shake the image of Karen's smug expression when she'd left his porch that morning, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. She had no idea who she was dealing with. But now, with his father's cryptic words ringing in his ears, he wasn't so sure anymore. "Be careful," his father had warned. But what did he mean by that? That afternoon, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He wasn't going to sit idly by while this woman dismantled his life, piece by piece. If she had a web of control in the neighborhood, it was time to start unraveling it, thread by thread. The first step was simple: gather information. He knew that every neighbor, every resident, had been affected by Karen's reign in some way. There was power in numbers. He just needed to find someone who would speak up, someone who had witnessed the darker side of her influence. His first stop was the Andersons' house down the street. The Andersons had always been friendly, albeit a bit reserved. Their garden was immaculate, the kind of place where every plant seemed carefully curated to comply with the HOA's strict guidelines. But there was a certain air of tension around them, something unsaid, something he noticed whenever he walked by. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, Mrs. Anderson opened it. Her eyes were wary at first, but when she saw who it was, her face softened. Still, there was an unease about her, a hesitation that lingered as she invited him in. I heard about what's been happening with Karen," she said, settling into an armchair and avoiding his gaze. "I'm not surprised, honestly. She's always had this way of controlling people." He sat down, trying to remain casual, though his mind was racing. "You've had problems with her too." Mrs. Anderson hesitated, glancing toward the window as if checking to see if anyone was watching. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "It's not just complaints about the lawn or the trash cans. Karen has files on everyone here. Personal things, things that have nothing to do with the HOA. She's been using that information to get what she wants from people." His stomach dropped. "Files? What kind of files?" "Do you mean personal information?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, eyes wide with fear. "Yes, her husband works for the local bank. He has access to records. Nothing major, just enough to dig into people's pasts. If she wants something from you, she uses that information. I know of at least 3 families who had to comply with her demands because she threatened to expose things that would ruin them. Their kids, their businesses. It's manipulation, pure and simple." The air in the room felt thick with the weight of her words. He leaned back in his chair, processing everything she just told him. This wasn't about petty complaints. This was blackmail, pure and simple. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was using people's deepest secrets to control them. And she was doing it in plain sight, like a puppet master pulling the strings of an entire neighborhood. "But why me?" he asked, almost to himself. "Why is she targeting me?" Mrs. Anderson's face grew pale. "I don't know, but if you want my advice, you need to get out. The more you push back, the more dangerous she'll get. She's already playing the game with you, and you're not the first one she's targeted." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Dangerous? How had it escalated so quickly? What else was she capable of? "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. "I'm going to take her down." Mrs. Anderson shook her head. "You don't know what you're dealing with. She's not just the HOA president. You don't understand. There's something more, something darker. People have disappeared before, people who tried to stand up to her. Think carefully before you make any moves." He stood, the weight of her words sinking in. Disappeared. Had Karen's influence reached so far? He needed answers, and the more he uncovered, the more he realized he was dealing with a monster hidden behind a mask of suburban normalcy. The night after his conversation with Mrs. Anderson, sleep was a distant thought. His mind raced, the weight of what she had revealed settling like a stone in his stomach. Disappeared. The word echoed in his thoughts. What had he gotten himself into? Karen wasn't just a controlling neighbor. She was a force, a shadow that had infiltrated every corner of the community. People had disappeared for trying to stand up to her. The air around him felt thicker now, heavier. He couldn't let fear control him, though. Fear had been Karen's weapon for so long, and now it was time for him to flip the script. He paced the small living room, his fingers brushing against the edges of his phone. He needed to get more information, proof that Karen's reach extended far beyond the HOA. If he could expose her web, maybe he could start tearing it apart, piece by piece. A thought struck him. The bank. Mrs. Anderson had mentioned her husband worked there. The same bank, perhaps, that had been feeding Karen the personal details she used to control the neighborhood. But what about the employees? Surely, someone would know what Karen was doing. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead he had left. The next morning, he found himself outside the local branch of the bank, trying to shake off the anxiety gnawing at his insides. He had no plan, no solid idea of what he was even looking for, but he knew one thing: he needed to get closer to Karen's network. If he could find a crack in the foundation, maybe he could force it to crumble. Walking into the bank, he took a deep breath. The air inside was cool, sterile, too quiet. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above him as he approached the counter. There, a woman in her mid-30s with dark, sharp eyes greeted him with a practiced smile. "Can I help you?" she asked politely, but there was something guarded in her demeanor. He hesitated for a moment, then forged ahead. "I'm looking for some records. Personal ones, actually. I believe you might have information about a Mrs. Karen. Her last name slips my mind, but she lives in the neighborhood. I think her husband works here." The woman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before it returned, tight-lipped. "I'm sorry, but we can't release information like that. Privacy regulations, you know." He kept his tone casual, trying to mask the urgency in his voice. "Oh, I understand. It's just, it's important. I've been trying to find out what happened to some of the people in the neighborhood. They've been, acting strange lately. Can't seem to reach them. It's all a little odd." Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. "What exactly are you implying, sir?" Before he could respond, a voice behind him cut in, and the woman at the counter's expression shifted dramatically. "Is there a problem here?" It was a man's voice, cold and commanding. The woman stiffened, and the tension in the air was palpable. He turned around to find a man in a sharp suit, his face tight with authority. He had the same sharp features as the woman, and there was something about him that seemed off. No problem," the woman stammered. "Just a misunderstanding." The man eyed him for a long moment, his gaze icy. "I suggest you leave. Now." The words hit him like a slap. There was no mistaking it. He was being watched. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was a warning. His blood ran cold as he turned and walked out of the bank. His mind was spinning. Had Karen sent someone to keep tabs on him? Had she been tracking his every move? The man in the suit was too polished, too calculated to be anything but connected to her. He'd felt the weight of her presence in that room, even though she wasn't physically there. The sense of dread grew stronger as he realized the web he was trying to unravel had deep, dangerous roots. Karen's influence wasn't just over the HOA. It was everywhere. He needed to be careful. Every step he took was being monitored, every move scrutinized. But there was no turning back now. He had to finish what he had started, no matter how deep the rabbit hole went. As the days passed, the tension continued to rise. Every time he stepped outside, it felt as if Karen's eyes were watching him from behind every curtain, from every window. The encounter at the bank had only deepened his paranoia. Whoever that man in the suit was, he wasn't just a random employee. He was a guardian of Karen's secrets, and the look in his eyes had made it clear. If he kept digging, the stakes would escalate. But there was no turning back now. He knew he needed something concrete, irrefutable evidence that would expose Karen and her twisted grip on the neighborhood. Without that, his fight would be nothing more than a war of words, easily dismissed and buried under her growing pile of complaints and threats. The answer came to him late one night as he was going through old neighborhood records he had gathered. Some of the files were from when the HOA had first formed, decades ago. There was one file that caught his eye, a thick folder buried beneath a stack of papers. It wasn't labeled like the others. There was no neat, official title on the front. Just a single word, scrawled in black ink: caution. His pulse quickened as he opened the file. Inside were a series of old emails, handwritten notes, and contracts. Documents he had never seen before. And then, in the back of the folder, he found something that sent a chill down his spine. A property deed, signed by Karen's husband, but it wasn't for their house. It was for another property, a large estate outside of town. The documents seemed innocuous at first glance, but as he dug deeper, the unsettling reality began to form. The estate had been purchased decades ago, long before Karen had even become the HOA president. But there was more. The deed was signed by several people, one of whom was a local business owner. The name wasn't familiar, but it looked like a front. And the signatures on the deed didn't match the business owner's name, only the initials of someone else. Karen's husband was part of something much larger than a simple HOA, a network of power that went far beyond suburban complaints. He had barely finished reading when he heard the soft creak of his front door opening. His heart leaped in his chest. Someone was inside. His mind raced. Had someone broken in? Had Karen sent someone to stop him? He quickly shoved the papers into his desk drawer, locking it. His instincts kicked in, and he grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, moving silently through the house. He crept down the hallway, his breath shallow, every sound magnified in the silence. The living room was empty, the shadows stretching long across the floor. But then he heard it. A soft rustling noise, barely audible, coming from the back of the house. He froze. The back door. Slowly, carefully, he moved toward it. His heart hammered in his chest, each step feeling like an eternity. He pushed open the door, the faint moonlight illuminating the backyard. The air was still, no one in sight. But the moment he stepped onto the porch, his eyes were drawn to the faint glow of a security camera in the corner of his yard. And then it hit him. He wasn't the one being watched. Karen was the one pulling the strings. His head snapped toward the darkened corner of the yard. And there, hidden beneath the bushes, was a small, inconspicuous black device. A hidden camera, capturing everything he did, every move he made. She had been watching him this whole time, tracking his every step without him even realizing it. The camera, the man at the bank, the threats. Everything began to click into place. He wasn't just up against a woman trying to enforce HOA rules. He was up against a shadow organization, a network of corruption that stretched deep into the heart of the town. His chest tightened as he realized how far Karen would go to protect her secrets. This wasn't just about power. This was about control. She had built an empire, and she wasn't about to let anyone tear it down. But there was one thing he knew for sure now. Karen had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated him. With a cold resolve, he took the camera from the bush, his mind already working on the next step. If Karen thought she could break him, she was wrong. The game had changed. He would use everything he had learned, every scrap of evidence, to bring her empire crashing down. But with every step he took toward the truth, the danger was growing. And Karen would stop at nothing to make sure he never exposed what lay beneath the surface. The hidden camera in his hands felt like a weight of impending doom. And yet, a sense of purpose was rising in him, stronger than ever. Karen had pushed him to the brink. But now he knew. He had the upper hand. The dark network she had woven in the shadows was about to unravel, piece by piece, and he would be the one to pull the thread. But the road ahead was fraught with danger. He could already feel Karen's eyes on him, lurking behind every corner, every hidden device. She knew he was getting closer, and she would do anything to stop him. He needed to act fast. The first thing he did was call his father, the sheriff. This time, there was no hesitation in his voice. "Dad, I need your help. I know what Karen's been doing, and I have proof, real proof. But I need your support. I can't do this alone." There was a pause, a long silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. And then, finally, his father spoke, the tone different this time, graver. "I've known for years, son. I've had my suspicions. But you were right. We couldn't move against her without concrete evidence. Now that you have it, I'll make sure we get this to the right people. The law won't ignore us." His heart sank with relief. For the first time, he wasn't alone in this fight. His father, the one man who could help him expose Karen's empire, was standing by him. But just as quickly, that relief was replaced by a gnawing sense of urgency. He knew what would come next. If Karen realized what he had discovered, she wouldn't hesitate to make him disappear just like the others. It was time to take the final step. The confrontation came sooner than he expected. Late that night, as he was reviewing the evidence, photos, videos, and the damning documents he had uncovered, he heard a knock at the door. It wasn't a normal knock. It was deliberate, forceful, almost commanding. His pulse raced. He knew exactly who it was. With the camera still tucked in his pocket, he moved cautiously toward the door, his mind already playing out the worst-case scenario. But when he opened it, there was no one there. Only a small, neatly folded note sitting on the doorstep. He picked it up with trembling hands and unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable, Karen's. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Leave now, and I'll let you walk away. You can't win." The words burned in his mind. Leave now. It was clear what she was offering. A threat, a warning, a final chance to surrender. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. There was too much at stake. He had come too far to back down. Instead, he stuffed the note into his pocket, his resolve hardening like steel. He was going to expose Karen, and he was going to do it with everything he had. The final move came the next day. Armed with his evidence, his father by his side, and a team of officers in tow, they stormed into the HOA office. Karen was there, of course, her usual smug demeanor plastered on her face, but the moment she saw them, the look in her eyes changed. Panic. It was the first crack in her perfect facade. "Karen," his father said, his voice calm but deadly serious, "you're under investigation. Your network, your manipulation, everything is coming to light. We're going to put an end to this." Karen stood frozen for a moment, her eyes darting around, trying to calculate her next move. But it was too late. The walls she had carefully constructed over the years were crumbling down around her. Her voice faltered. "You don't know what you're doing. You think you can win against me. You're just one person." But he wasn't one person. He was everyone she had ever wronged. The whole neighborhood, all the lives she had controlled, the fear she had sown. It was all coming for her now. "We know everything, Karen." He stepped forward, pulling out the hidden camera, the documents, the evidence of everything she had been doing in the dark. "You're done." The blood drained from her face, and for the first time, the mask of the untouchable queen cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. She tried to reach for something, anything, to hold on to, but it was over. The truth was out, and there was no hiding anymore. As the officers took her away, the feeling that washed over him wasn't victory, it was relief. The weight that had been bearing down on him for weeks was finally lifted, and though the fight was over, the scars of it would remain. But in that moment, as he watched Karen disappear into the back of a police car, he knew one thing for certain. The neighborhood was free. And as for him, he had learned that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones you fight for those who can't fight for themselves. The truth had won, and he had made sure it would never be silenced again.